Welcome to Macro Minds, where I talk to economists and other experts about the issues of our time. Welcome to Macro Minds. I'm your host, Kallum Pickering. Today I'm joined by Mickey Levy, a US economist, a good friend of mine. Mickey's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's a member of the Shadow Open Market Committee. He was Chief Economist at Bank of America. He was Chief Economist at Berenberg Capital Markets. And today we'll be discussing the upcoming US election and the outlook for Federal Reserve monetary policy. Mickey, it's great to have you on. Thank you.
Pleasure to be on.
So I think we could perhaps just kick off with your top-down view of the candidates' proposals for economic policy, candidate Harris and candidate Trump. I noticed in your Wall Street Journal article, you said both are putting forward anti-growth measures that are needlessly testing the resilience of the dynamic U.S. economy. I thought that was a nice way to put it. So I'll leave you to it now.
Okay, Cal, thank you very much. So I have, ever since 1992, I have done a side-by-side analysis of the presidential's economic platforms and tried to be even-handed. And what I find in analyzing Biden and now Harris, who's absorbed most of Biden's platform, and Trump is they're the most polarizing in terms of their economic platforms. Neither addresses the major issue facing the U.S., that is the high deficits and debt. Neither seems to understand any history, and both of their platforms, taken on face value, would be decidedly negative for the U.S. economy for different reasons, and they would both reverberate globally. And that's a summary. So really, being even-handed, Callum, it's really quite disappointing when you look at the U.S. that has the highest potential growth among all advanced economies, and then you look at their platforms, and then they've augmented their platforms by trying to buy votes through more giveaways, and it's really shocking how they would, reading face value, both of them would be definitively negative for the U.S. economy.
Instead of comparing the platforms side by side, could you give a little detail on how the platforms differ from a typical Republican manifesto regarding Trump, and then, of course, a typical Democratic manifesto for Harris? I think that's the interesting point here. They're decidedly different from what you would expect in a number of ways.
Cal, you're right. Okay, so Trump actually follows a fairly traditional Republican platform on taxes. That is, he wants to extend the 2017 tax cuts that cut individual taxes and corporate taxes, and they're due to expire in 2025. So he wants to extend those. On spending, he's a little more lax than most traditional Republican platforms. But where he parts ways decidedly from traditional Republican platforms is this very, very heavy reliance on central control. He's a control freak, and this is really antithetical to traditional Republican values, where it's driven by allowing free enterprise and letting markets work. And so this command and control is really throws a curveball at things, and it leaves traditional Republicans scratching their heads that it's really not traditional. Also, some of his proposals, like deporting millions of immigrants, that would be impossible to implement. But nevertheless, so he really is not a traditional Republican. He's a central control guy, and to me, that's quite negative. Okay, Harris, when I compare her economic platform to other Democratic presidential candidates. Her platform is very similar to Bernie Sanders in 2016. Dramatic increases in taxes, not just on individual income taxes, raising rates from current 37% up to 44%, taxing capital gains, realized capital gains at 44% rather than the current 23.8%. And she has a proposal to, if you can believe this, tax unrealized capital gains for very high wealth people. But Callum, a key point here is there has been such an increase in the stock market and household net worth and the value of private investments that if that provision of taxing unrealized capital gains were implemented, it would force tens of thousands of family offices and high wealth individuals to sell stock just to pay taxes. And it could unravel things. Now, in addition, she proposes price caps to control, quote unquote, price gouging. We know historically that's never worked. And she's, definitively anti-business. And so you have these, so let's think of the economics. And one other provision, she would recommend an increase in U.S. corporate taxes and an alignment minimums on U.S. corporate taxes. So if Harris were to win and she were able to implement everything, we have to get into that.
Yeah.
Higher taxes would have a definitively negative impact on business investment, capital spending, and the economy in general by dramatically increasing taxes. And that would be
what strikes me. What strikes me about this is the U.S. economy has for the past 2 or 3 years done enormously well. Actually, it looks vibrant. It's been growing quickly. It's managed to keep the labor market healthy and bring the rate of inflation down to what is now a tolerable rate. Much better than the performance we saw after the global financial crisis by any comparison. And yet both candidates propose radical economic policies. That on its own, I think, is just it's a striking observation. Let me, before we get into the question of who gets Congress and what that might mean for putting the policies through, let's just take the policies at face value. Growth, inflation, markets. What would you expect to see for both candidates, roughly, directionally?
Directionally, Harris, if she were to win and implement everything, it would be definitively negative for the economy. And let me go on. Even the threat of taxing unrealized capital gains and all realized capital gains would clobber the stock market, and it would harm the economy and particularly undercut business investment. And business investment has been one of the big contributors to economic growth. And of course, that now on Trump, dramatically high. Okay, so if he were, of course, to deport immigrants, which I doubt he would be able to, that would be a negative for the economy. But a tariff is a tax. With a tariff, companies are have to pay tariffs to the U.S. government when they import things. And then they pass on most of those increase in operating costs to consumers. So it's negative for the economy. Now, Callum, add things. Now, his platform, which is more pro-business, wouldn't clobber the stock market, but it would be definitively negative. So think about it in economic terms. Both platforms, if they were fully implemented, would reduce economic growth and reduce productivity and expected after-tax rates of return on capital, which would not right away, but over time, be associated with lower real interest rates and lower real exchange rates. So I'm looking for the dollar to weaken if they were to implement everything, and lower rates. So once again, how that latter part would work is if they were to implement their policies, you'd have weaker economic growth, and the Fed would respond accordingly. So,
do you think that so weaker economic growth because both are pursuing misguided supply side policies? Is there a difference on the demand side? Is Trump stimulating demand, whereas Harris is, say, neutral for demand? So you have lower growth, normal rates of inflation, Harris, lower growth, upside inflation risks Trump. Is that the framework?
Okay. I would say offsetting some of Harris's definitively negative tax policies, she would pump some $25 billion into pumping up housing, and that would offer a partial offset. Trump has fewer offsets. Not taxing certain things. Both would increase child care credits and the like, but those are kind of small potatoes.
Just to get the organization right, just to help us understand, there are certain things that president can do via executive order, and there are certain things that you need Congress for, roughly speaking. And plausible outcomes are roughly fourfold. Harris, full sweep, Harris makes Congress. Trump, full sweep, Trump makes Congress. If we go through various categories of policy, so if I say foreign trade, taxation, can you help me understand what you need Congress for? So on foreign policy issues, you do need Congress or not so much?
You do need Congress on foreign issues. Now look, let's go through, not to throw a monkey wrench into your framework, which I like and I've written about, let's add a fifth scenario.
Okay.
And the fifth alternative is a contested election. And that's a scary scenario, which it happened in 2000, in November of 2000, where you had a contested election. We didn't know for over 3 weeks whether Gore.
That was Gore versus Bush, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was going to be president, but that was a different era. And if you look back at that period, the stock and bond and markets didn't do much. The currency didn't do much. Now.
And some overlap between those two policy platforms. Just to be clear, not a lot, but at least they were mostly pro-market centrist. Yeah, much similar.
Okay. Now this time around, all fiscal action requires Congress. So the House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee writes all tax legislation. So yes, you're correct. If Harris wins and Republicans say gain control of the Senate, which is what the current polls say, then she could say anything. She could propose anything she wants as president, but it wouldn't become reality. So what you would end out with is, on say the expiration of Trump's 2017 tax cuts, they would be negotiated, and you'd get marginally higher taxes. On a Harris win and Democratic sweep, that is the only scenario that I would encourage people to hedge their stock portfolios, because then you have risks of dramatically higher taxes, particularly higher taxes on capital, and this threat, which is unheard of in any advanced economy. And of course, the U.S. biggest stock market in the world, tax on unrealized capital gains. Now,
so there are two more buckets then. So fiscal, so that's taxation, government spending. You'll need full sweep in Congress to get those policies through. Foreign policy, it's a bit mixed, but you need Congress. I suppose the same applies to immigration policy. You need Congress on immigration policy.
No, that's uncertain. But wait, let me go on here. If Trump wins, and once again, if Democrats maintain even control of the House or the Senate, then they could block a lot of his proposed tax legislation, and it would be negotiated. Now, you're bringing out this critically important point that Congress has its hand in tax and spending policy. And by the way, once again, neither party is recommending addressing the entitlement programs and the debt problem. But the power of the executive is very, very strong. And the president, through executive order and through legislation, through regulations, can have a big, big impact and circumvent the Congress. If we look back to mid-2018, President Trump implemented his higher tariffs and tariff wars against China using Section 232 on national, relying on national security, and didn't need to go through Congress to get those higher tariffs. The issue of deporting immigrants, that's going to be up in the air, and you could see, if Trump were to be elected and he tried to do that, you could see the Supreme Court coming in. But so now let me go to another issue.
So Trump mixed Congress could pursue under that scenario his trade policy, but he would be hamstrung by the checks and balances in Congress on fiscal policy. Would you expect Congress to try and broker a deal with Trump where they say, we'll let you get some of your fiscal stuff through, but you can't go ahead with your tariff policy?
They would try, but I'd say Kallum, they would try, but I'd say the bigger pushback would not be from Congress. It would be from select U.S. companies that rely heavily on imports and who are friendly with Trump. And they go, like you take a huge importer, the CEO who might have somebody who's friendly with the Trump camp would just come in and say, come on, you can't do that. It would hammer us. And he would say, okay, I'll back off. But let me go to this other point I made about executive power. Everybody's focusing on Trump, but Harris would be through regulatory powers, without disregarding Congress, could push through some price controls, which history, and she says she will, and history, of course, in the U.S. says these are a disaster. So the checks and balances reads good on paper, but they can be circumvented by a very powerful president, and people have come to understand that Trump, likes central control. If you just simply look at the Biden administration, they, through regulations, have had a huge impact on corporate structures, mergers. Harris would put in price controls. So fasten your seatbelt. Now, I want to get to another important area before you ask. Okay, the Senate is also very important. The Senate Finance Committee can not only block a lot of things. The Senate's kind of like the grown-up in the room. But importantly, on the Federal Reserve, all new governors are nominated by the president and have to be confirmed by the Senate and get through the Senate Banking Committee. So if Republicans gain control of the Senate, even by one vote, then the chair of the Senate Banking Committee rules the roost on who Trump would be able to nominate to be a governor. And this is critically important because everybody's worried about, Trump has said he wants to, control the Fed more. Guess what? It's all rhetoric. He can't. Now, when Powell, typically what happens, when Powell retired, or when his role as chair ends in early 2026, Trump will be able to nominate a new, if he's elected president, would be able to nominate a new chair. That person, whether they can get through the confirmation process, they have to be vetted through the Senate Banking Committee.
A couple of points on just on history, and I'm testing my own knowledge of U.S. history here, but the Republicans tried tariffs smoot-hawley in the 30s, and then you had price controls under, was it Carter in the 1970s? I'm confident on the second claim. I'm not so sure about the first claim. Was it Carter who tried price controls?
No,
Was it?
you're right. Smoot-Hawley,
Was tariffs for Republicans.
during the Depression, and they withdrew them a couple of years later. They were a disaster.
Yeah.
And it was under President Nixon,
Okay.
who imposed wage and price controls in beginning in August 1971. And even with the wage and price controls, they were impossible to implement. They're widely referred to in economic circles as one of the worst policies in U.S. history. And even with those wage and price controls, it's interesting, Cal. So they put them on. The next year, Nixon's up for re-election. Then Fed Chair Arthur Burns pumps up, doesn't raise interest rates when they should have, pumps up the economy to help Nixon get reelected. And even with the wage and price controls, inflation goes up to 8% before the first Arab oil embargo, and then everything just blows up.
Well, I got my decade right, the 1970s. I mean, the only reason I bring that up is, there's the 20th century for the US might be the most studied period across all economics. You have really good evidence to show that both candidates' policies are misguided because we've been here before. I just want to finish with one question on the politics just before we move to some Fed stuff. You mentioned the stock market. I just wondered about the bond market. I mean, when I look at the U.S. yield curve, it almost implicit at the longer end is just this trust that eventually the U.S. is going to start pursuing sensible fiscal policies. And I get the impression you have your doubts under both candidates. So are you nervous that the bond market may start to grow worried under either candidate scenario?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, look, neither candidate is proposing any fiscal responsibility. And the only way you can cut deficits is to cut spending on the entitlement programs, but you'd have to grandfather it in so it doesn't hit people right away. Kallum, so when we think about bond markets, let's give the Fed credit. They really made a grand mistake in 2021, 2022 by accommodating the deficits by too much. They won't admit it, but now the Fed has raised rates, and you might be mildly restrictive, but to give the Fed credit, inflationary expectations are pretty closely anchored to 2%. And you have bond yields, like the 10-year bond yields are like 4.20. So if you take an ex-ante real rate, it's in the range of responsibility about 2%. I happen to think that's fair, that's appropriate. When we think about the impact of deficits, there are several issues. One is the increase in the debt per se and the extent to which U.S. and foreign creditors are willing to continue to buy the debt. About a third of government debt is U.S. government debt is held by foreigners. But it's also what your deficit spending for and how the allocation of national resources affects economic growth. And yeah, I think there could be a little nervousness. About this, but the real odd thing here is, so the Fed is minding its P's and Q's now, and it with the real federal funds rate, about 2.5 percentage points above inflation. That is, inflation's 2.5. The effective Fed funds rate is say 4.9. So that's a higher real funds rate than any time since before the financial crisis. However, if you go back to the second half of the 1990s, when we had very strong productivity-driven growth, the real funds rate was over 3%. And so once again, the improvement in productivity and all the technological innovations and stronger growth have probably lifted the natural rate of interest. And so the Fed doesn't have that much room to ease. But I'd say overall, am I concerned about budget deficits and the rising debt? Absolutely. I'm very concerned. And people say, oh, in the long run, it may eventually affect the U.S. Well, guess what? It's affecting the U.S. right now. It's affecting the way the government is deliberating on policies, how it's allocating resources, and how it's affecting government, how it's affecting the real sector.
I think that's a really the way you put it. Then is the debt level affecting the U.S.? Well, you could run the scenario. Would policymakers be making the same choices if debt were lower? The answer is no, and then therefore, obviously, the debt level is affecting. Turning to the U.S., to the U.S. Fed. What strikes me when I look at the Fed's forecast development, and I've got two of the dot plots and the projections sat in front of me. The first one's from March 2022, which was the first meeting when the Fed raised rates, and then I've got September 24, which is the most recent one. The thing that's shifted the most is the longer run projection for the federal funds rates moved up from 2.4 to 2.9. But when I look at the longer run estimate of real GDP growth, it's still at 1.8%. Now the range has grown, and you see more upside at the longer end. But the point you make around productivity growth may be already visible, at least in the way the Fed is thinking about the U.S. economy, because if you've had a positive technology shock, you would expect the real neutral rate to be a little higher. Now, I'm not going to ask you what you think the neutral rate is, but there are two things going on here, I think. The first is the Fed's raising the neutral rate because it's realized, actually, well, policy is evidently not as tight as we thought, owing to the consistent upside surprises. But second, the reason that the long run estimate was so low was actually as a forward guidance tool to try and commit to lower for longer after the global financial crisis. And so I think, could you just help us understand what the different forces are on U.S. potential growth at the moment, and how the Fed's going to be thinking about this? Because on the one hand, you have this big fiscal impulse, but then you also have technology. And is the Fed trying to ease monetary policy? Is the Fed trying to take monetary policy to neutral? And if so, where do you think they'll end up with rates?
Yeah. Okay. These are great questions. Now, keep in mind the Fed's SEPs, their summary of economic projections. They're by the FOMC members, and they're conditional forecasts. And I don't have time to go into the conditionality,
sure,
but they also are used for forward guidance. Now, on the Fed's estimate of long-run potential growth, 1.8%, that they've been stuck there for several years, and it's very, very low because it has built into it 1.3 percentage points growth in productivity, which seems low given the technological innovations and the dramatic improvements in technological innovation and the rapid implementation into commerce. And I would say productivity's actually been well above that, and 0.5% growth in the labor force. And what their forecast is totally missing is, aside from the improvement in productivity, there have been 9 million new immigrants to the U.S. since 2020, and they're already affecting the demand side of the economy. That is, they're consuming shelter, they're eating, and they're starting to come into the workforce. So what's interesting is the CBO has two different forecasts: an intermediate term of potential growth, about 2.25, and then they have it sifting back down. I'm way above the Feds. So I think their 1.8 is low. Now, on their long run estimate of their funds rate, that includes, and it had been 2.5 for a long time,
mm-hmm.
and now it's up to 2.8. Now that includes their 2% inflation target for the long run, plus whatever we call the natural rate that's consistent with the economy growing along its potential path and achieving 2% inflation. I think that is way, way too low. Recent estimates within the Fed using what they call the Lawback-Williams model has R star, or the natural real rate of interest, up to 1.2. Callum, I think it's closer to 2.0.
Yeah.
And that would leave the long run equilibrium rate, and that's similar to what Taylor said in his Taylor rule in 1993. That would leave the equilibrium rate of the funds rate that is consistent with 2% inflation and the economy growing along its potential path at about 4%, which leaves the Fed much less room to ease. Now, on current monetary policy, I can ask a simple question. The Fed, and Powell says this all the time, and it's echoed by other Fed members, they say monetary policy is restrictive. And that is based on just this simple notion that the federal funds rate, which is now 4.9%, is 2.5 percentage points above inflation. But that is based on the notion that the economy and the real rate is very similar to the rates that persisted following the financial crisis.
Yeah, that's right.
Weak. And once again, you go back to the 1990s when you had strong productivity-driven growth, and the real funds rate was 3%. So I could ask this interesting question: how can the Fed say that monetary policy is restrictive if, in fact, the economy is growing faster than their estimate of potential?
That's exactly the way to look at it.
And inflation is 2.5%, which is above their target. So in fact,
I mean, let's suppose you didn't know what the funds rate was. Yeah, that's it. Let's suppose you had 10 economists who said, I can't tell you where the funds rate is. Yeah. The Fed thinks the neutral is here. Look at the evidence in inflation and growth and stock market performance and credit demand and the like. How tight do you think monetary policy is? I don't think they'd say 250 basis points. I should draw everyone's attention to a great piece that you wrote with Michael Border, which is a 50-year history of the shadow open market committee and evolution of monetary policy. In that, you make a point, I think it's about the Greenspan era, where the Fed was happier to look down at 2% than look up at 2%, which suggests a sort of implicit inflation bias. When you think about the Fed today, it has a dual mandate, 2% average inflation target, maximum inclusive employment, but is it more realistically maximum employment at tolerable levels of inflation? Is that a better way to think about it? Because I don't think the Fed is going to run inflation below 2% to hit it to average.
That's right. No, yeah. Callum, I think your characterization is, so inflation now, whether you look at the core or the headline PCE price, PCE inflation, that's about 2.5%. The CPI, which is probably a better measure in many ways, is higher. But what you see is the Fed, in its strategic plan that it pushed through in 2020, it allows higher inflation. Yeah. It prioritizes employment. So if you remember, before the September employment report that was way above expectations, you had seen this slowing employment, and so the Fed just extrapolated that would continue, and so they cut 50 basis points. They definitely. What's interesting here is inflation's 2.5. Is it tolerable? It's above their target. My hunch is they'd say behind closed doors, well, it's okay to have 2.5 inflation because, different like market-based estimates of inflationary expectations are about 2.25, and that's okay. So we could kind of run a little hot and keep employment strong
with a straight face.
So they definitely have a tilt here, and that's revealed in the way they talk their policy actions.
Yeah, it might be hard to keep that up if the next candidate pursues inflationary policies. So, Mickey, I'd just like to thank you for joining me. We always have a good chat. I really appreciate you coming on. Could you let people know where they might be able to find you? You have your column in the Wall Street Journal, but where else?
Okay, so I have a website. It's mickey.d.levy.com. No periods. Look me up, and I'm fully engaged in what's happening. And I, we focus mostly on the U.S. I'd love to give you an earful on, what's happening in Europe or China.
I think we do that for the next episode. Mickey, thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much.